am Siddharth Shivakumar, and on behalf of KCC, I welcome you all to the second episode of Articulating the Art of Bengal 1750 to 1947. Today, we will be looking at nationalism, colonial legacy, and the churning, early decades of the 20th century Kolkata, or simply put, the Bengal School of Art. This is a well known period in the history of Indian art, but more comes to light every other day as it is scrutinized with new critical lenses. The period was marked by a heightened sense of nationalism, and Abanindranath Tagore found himself at the crossroads where the Occident has succeeded in positioning itself and its cultural heritage as a superior model for the rest to follow, and where Rabindranath's call against such cultural imperialism was becoming louder. What happens when Havel became a collaborator and aided Abanindranath to change the agenda, especially of the Government School of Art? There were consequences, of course, in the Bengal art scene, ripples of which could be seen moving away from the center and forming counter currents and discourses. Beyond the towering figures of Abanindranath and Bhavanindranath, the speakers also looked closely at Hemendranath Majumdar, Atul Bose, and others. Sunoyani Devi also emerges as an important artist who remained mostly unrecognized until recently. The speakers also discuss the disconnect between the leaders of the Bengal school and the followers. They further distinguish the professional artists from those whose engagements were chiefly driven by leisurely output. Let me now briefly introduce our speakers for the session. Professor Indrapramit Roy is a dynamic artist, teacher, writer, and illustrator. Since 1995, he has been teaching painting at the Faculty of Fine Arts, MSU. So you see, Indrapramit Roy has been engaged in teaching art for decades now, straddling simultaneously his own painterly practice and vocation as a writer. Joining him today is Professor Samindranath Majumdar, who is a faculty member of the Department of Painting at the Indian College of Arts and Draftsmanship in Kolkata. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in visual arts from the Rabindra Bharati University. His works dwell around semi-abstract visual language. Professor Majumdar writes regularly for various publications and is an expert on Hemendranath Majumdar. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the session.
Today's discussion, we are going to take a closer look, and for the sake of brevity, we have decided to concentrate only on Kolkata because there is a time limit. So, it is a very elaborate topic because there were things happening within Bengal school, which is what we are going to discuss, me and Shomindranath, is the complex strands and the multiple ones that ran within this overarching theme of what was happening primarily in the first 3 decades of 20th century. So we are obviously not going to cover each and every artist, and to show for the sake of the argument, we are basically choosing a few to illustrate the point. So we begin obviously with the father of it all, Abanindranath Tagore, who, as is well known, was nephew of poet Tagore, and the slide with a family tree will explain how he was related to the Tagores. Now, by the beginning of the century, Abanindranath was already experimenting and he was dissatisfied. Mind you, he has never been to the art school. He was in a way self-taught, but he had people coming from the art school to teach him. And particular of them was one Mr. Giladi, who was associated with the art school, who taught him oil painting, but he was not very happy and satisfied. And of course, there was, by the first decade, an overwhelming idea of a national art, which also comes from a certain colonial mentality. Mind you, by then the art schools are well established. They all started happening all over in the major metropolises of Calcutta, of Madras, of Bombay, Lucknow, and Lahore in the mid 19th century, in the 1850s and 60s. They were established and they had a reputation of producing a kind of art which was obviously emphasizing the academic legacy, which was very much part of the colonial education policy. And what Rabindranath himself talks about, there is a little quote. I think that explains the situation where Abanindranath's rebellion come to the fore. And I quote, "The humiliation constantly heaped upon us by people who had the habit of sharply dividing the human world according to the hemisphere that they belong, that is, Occident and the Orient. And the view being that Occident triumphs, the Orient is much more of a regressive world, and it really has nothing much to offer to the modern world that the Occident is building." And furthermore, it actually was enhancing an educational policy which by and large was basically telling the Indians that whatever tradition you have had is regressive, it's anti modern, and for modernism, you will have to look at the mother country, which was England, and learn from the Occident. That's the only way to to get out of this morass. So Tagore goes on to say that that generated in our young men at all things that came to them as an inheritance from their past, they were laughing at it. You know, whatever was inherited from the past in imitation of their European schoolmasters. And in a way, Abanindranath's initial reaction was to that. So he learned oil and he refused to paint in oil. He was offered to study nudes and he refused it because it was not to his taste. So he was looking for an alternative and he found it. He found it around the turn of the century, and the first work that is known to us is the Krishna Lila series, where he was quite heavily influenced by the Rajasthani miniatures and to some extent the Mughal miniatures. By 1905, there is a bonding that happens, and interestingly, because the new superintendent of the government school in Calcutta, it wasn't a college then, it was called a school, art school, but Havel was very central to this project, and Havel found in Abanindranath a collaborator. Now, this is basically the background where it happened. Then, of course, when this was happening, in the process, what Havel did is he threw away a lot of art work that was in the collection of the government school, which were mostly copies of British painting and Italian Mannerist paintings and plaster casts of Greco Roman figures. So these were all given as the model to follow to the students. And when he threw them away, a section of the students themselves felt betrayed because they felt that Havel is actually depriving them of learning these new techniques, new methods, which is the forward looking thing, and insisting that they look back to their own tradition, which is what Havel was doing because he replaced them with authentic, original Indian paintings, artifacts, craftwork of all manner of things. And a big section of that was, of course, painting. So he started collecting Indian miniature paintings and scroll tankas and sculptures and artifacts, all manners of things. And it was divided into fine arts and industrial arts. You know, these were the two categories and actually constituted a museum. And at this point of time, a section rebels against it and goes out and forms a new institution called Jubilee Art School. The point is that he found the Abanindranath a collaborator and he gets Abanindranath to join the as an assistant principal in 1905. And unfortunately, Havel had to leave under unfortunate circumstances, and though he was supposed to come back, he never really manages to come back. So it falls on Abanindranath to carry on the legacy for the next 4 or 5 years. He was given a free hand, although Percy Brown comes and joins, but Percy Brown himself goes on a long leave. So till about 1915, when he resigns from this post, so those 10 years he was teaching, and he set up a major curriculum where his manner of painting, which is the Indian style of painting, was highlighted, and it produced many a painter. And most of his first generation painters like Nandalal Bose, like Shitin Majumdar, like Asit Haldar, like Sharada and Ranoda Ukil, Monishi De, K. Venkatappa, Shamarendranath Gupta, they all spread out all over India. So by the middle of 1910s decade, these were the people who were running the show in many art colleges. Shamarendranath Gupta goes to Lahore, Venkatappa goes to Mysore, Shamarendra, Ashit Haldar goes to Lucknow, and so on and so forth. And that is the sort of reason behind the rapid spread of this ideology. My point today being that Abanindranath himself was he was hailed as the painter of Mother India. That was one iconic work which was associated with the nationalist movement. And before that, in 1902, he painted this image of Shah Jahan wistfully looking at Taj Mahal in his old days when he's dying, and he was imprisoned by his own son, was looked after by his own daughter. So it's a very sentimental image, but as far as the construction of it is concerned, he really borrows from the Mughal miniature, although it is painted in oil. Bharat Mata is unique in some sense because it is not painted in oil. It is by then he has already invented this technique of wash painting, of what he is known for and what was perpetrated by Bengal school as the true alternative to oil painting, and spread all over the country. And it was something that he learned partly from Japanese wash techniques. And the Japanese connection is very important. There were two, three things that were happening simultaneously. One was the visit of Count Okakura Kakuzo, who came in India in 1901 and stayed in the Tagore household. And then he went back and came back again, and he was writing a very important book which basically explained his theory that Asian art and Asian culture has something in common, that Asia is one and it is in opposition to the Occident. So this was the architect of the intellectual stimulus, you can say. Was one of them is Okakura Kakuzo. Others were Anand Kintish Kumar Swami, who was an art critic and an art historian who came from Sri Lanka and also was associated with the Tagore household in Jorasanko. And the third pole would be Sister Nivedita, who very ardently wrote about the need for Indian artists to not deride their own history and tradition and go back and revisit it and reinvent it for contemporary usages. So these were the sort of three intellectual streams which were egging them on. Of course, Havel was very much there and he was supporting. And Abanindranath find himself in this very conducive atmosphere, and his practice develops. Okay. Now, Abanindranath paints these paintings and they get printed, they get disseminated through a network of things. Partly, Last Days of Shah Jahan was printed in a journal in England. Bharat Mata was taken up by, mind you, 1905 is also the time when Curzon declares the partition of Bengal, and whole of Bengal erupts in rebellion against it because it was looked upon as a political ploy to divide Bengal on communal lines. And Abanindranath's work was hailed as the iconic representative of what stood for the concept of, initially it was titled Bangamata and then eventually it became Bharat Mata. But and it is a problematic image, but we are not getting into that problem because ultimately it is a very sort of a religious image, and religious symbolism is implicit in it, which is being critiqued later that he was a sort of a Hindu suprematist of a hidden kind, which is so untrue because the rest of the work, if you look at, would disapprove this point. But the point is that that painting or this body of painting from the early 20th century defines the character of Abanindranath for the rest of India, because the way his students were carrying forward this became the ruling house style of nationalist painting for the next 2 decades. Now, the point is that Abanindranath himself actually moves away from this. He's one of his prime students, Nandalal Bose, goes to Shantiniketan and starts some other kinds of experiments which are heavily influenced by the nature, his exposure to nature, his exposure to the life of the Santals, the local people. And again, he, although vestigially holds on to this notion of Bengal school, in real terms, his work moves away. Now, we are not going into that because Shantiniketan is outside the purview of our work. So, this blanket term of Bengal school actually had many strands emerging from it. Now, in today's talk, we are also going to bring in the contrarian idea, which was germinated perhaps in the functioning of Jubilee Art School, which broke away from Havel's idea and established a very strong practice with quite a few very strong practitioners who were standing in opposition because they considered that the technique of oil or watercolor in the British manner, as opposed to what Abanindranath was doing, is a valid way of representing the world in which we belong. And that is the true modern way of dealing with it. And they felt that by looking back at our own traditions and wistfully recreating a kind of glory days of the past, which was mistakenly construed as the only objective of Bengal school, was the wrong tree to bark up, basically. So there was this strand. And then there was a third strand, which we will come to. But before we go there, let's have a very quick look at the works of Abanindranath and how he quickly proves that his only contribution to art was not generating this nationalist language. His own work actually moves away very quickly from what his reputation was built on, which is a supreme irony because these works were seen very little and hence it was not part of the public discourse till very recently. So, if we look at the portraiture that he made, for instance, which had a tremendous amount of sensitivity, whether it's a portrait of Rabindranath or whether it's a portrait of Anand Kuntish Kumar Swami, and he was also simultaneously doing Omar Khayyam. He was doing that. He painted that work of the dying camel, which had a reference to Middle Eastern folks and legends. So it wasn't that he was stuck only in mythifying Mother India. He moves quickly away. What is more interesting is by 1912 he produces a set of works called Bengal Actors, where he is actually taking a very humorous look at people who were involved in this performance of various characters. There is one of a Shiva. That Shiva is a sort of fuddy-duddy character, like a henpecked husband who's mostly spending his time in burning ghats. And it is not the Shiva Mahakala of the Vedic tradition. It is a very Bengalified version of Shiva. And there is a precedence that one can find in the Kalighat works of 18th and mid 19th century. So there is a reference to that. Or, if more interestingly, if you take a look at the Rati Devi, where Rati Devi is in a very hoity-toity pose, looking down, but is dressed in a gown and wearing flowers, which are not authentic flowers. It's some kind of paper flowers, possibly, and you can even see a wristwatch. And I found that pose has close proximity with the Sir John Tenniel's illustrations for Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen, for instance. So these are the things were done even before Gaganendranath launches on his caricatures. And Gaganendranath is the other brother whom we are going to talk a little bit in detail today. and we are, overlooking a lot of people. There are many names that one can discuss about, but these are the three names that we are going to talk, all from the Tagore family and their slightly different trajectories. Yes, Shavindra.
What I was suggesting here is that the similarity of the drawing between these two brothers. I mean, here we can see that it's very conspicuous over here. I mean, if you see the figure construction of the figure, even the fingers, the thick fingers, and everything, every small nuances that relates to the work of Gaganendranath in a way. So that is my take here, right, on this part of Abhinandan's work. And I feel that there is a connection between these two because they were actually working together sitting on Dokhine's Baranda. So it might have happened that he has taken, I mean, the influence is there from his brother while working these kind of works.
Yes, there was a lot of mutual influence, as we know that they were sharing the same studio in Dokkiner Baranda, where they would pretty much spend their whole working day, and the working day included their leisure time also, as was seen in the Nandalal drawing, which was also made into a woodcut, which we will quickly take a look at. Uh, but yes, you are quite right, and it is quite possible, and it is actually more than possible, that they were looking and getting inspired by each others. But interesting fact is that Gaganendranath's first set of caricatures published in 1915, I think. Yes, Adbhut Lok. And here we have a set of works, and I'm just showing you two, which was done in 1912 and which sets the tone, and it is also indicative of how Abanindranath was not only interested in the classical traditions but also in the local and the folk and the so-called Deshi traditions as opposed to the Margi ones. And this is a strand that will keep reappearing in Gaganendranath's life. So if when we reduce Abanindranath to this nationalist icon, we seem to be overlooking all these um, departures, and him consolidating and trying to make a language cobbling many different strands. And of course, one of the more important strand was the classical tradition, but there it is interwoven with the Desi. So the Margi and the Desi becomes very much part of the exploration of Abanindranath. Now we go to next set of works, and again I'm showing just one because of the shortness of time. There is this landscape from Shahzadpur, which is their zamindari that they visit around 1927, which are very moody landscapes where he uses a kind of wash technique only he invented, uh, not wholly uninspired by the Japanese tradition. And mind you, the Japanese artists, there was a constant stream of them after Okakura, who were sent by Okakura, who took shelter and stayed with the Jorasanko artists, and the more important ones were Taikan and Hishida Sunso. Yokohama Taikan and Hishida Sunso visited Calcutta in 1903. They stayed for nearly a year. Then they go back and they were part of the Nihonga artists. So they were teaching things to the Tagore brothers, that is Abanindranath and Gaganendranath, and themselves were learning things from the Bengal school. Then comes another gentleman called Shokin in 1905, and he stays till 1907. And finally, R.I. Kampo, who also stays in India for 2 years. So, this give and take between the Japanese artist and the Jorasanko artist was a given, and which was obviously seen in both the development of the wash technique of the Bengal school as well as the Chinese or Japanese brush and ink manner of painting that Gaganendranath's work actually reflects very clearly. But also was very important in the development of the wash technique. Now, if we come to this mask set, which was done in 1929, and you would see that uh, Abanindranath's interest in theatre manifestly expressing itself in these masks. And I think Shomindra would like to say something here about his interest in theatre and how he uh, chanced upon the masks or why he decided to do that body of work. Yes, please.
Yes, I was just about to say that Abanindranath did have a keen interest in theatre. We do know that he did act in various plays, especially uh, in the comedies in Thakurbari. So change of person into persona was known to him. So if we see these masks, we can see this interchangeable thing, this changing of I mean, changing the persona out of a person. In the past, that is very conspicuous. Now, he has done this in 1929, and Mohanlal Gangopadhyay suggested that he has done 70, around 70 masks. But though I have not seen even a fraction of them, but it's a fact that we are getting out of it, out of him. So many of these masks have different shapes. Say for at some time we can see that he has juxtaposed two shapes together, mixes two shapes together and created another. He has created a mask with the shape of kite, and sometimes a vase is coming out with the face. So he has mixed that. Here he played with the mask and uh, with the face. Both in both ways he was actually playing. But interestingly, if we see in a in some masks, we can see that there is a kind of long extension uh, with the mask. It is like what we see in the theater. The the who the actor who are using the mask, they hold that uh, you know extended part and using the mask on the over their face. So he has also used that thing in the picture in these images, and together with he has also used the string or small rope with the mask. So these masks are not only the masks uh, on the image, on the picture plane, and without any connection of the theater. But at times, these masks have the connection with theater. So there are two types of masks in this way. We can see there are some masks where we cannot see the string or the extension, long extension with the face part, but there are some masks where we can see both the things. At times some strings, at times a long extension. So that directly refers to the theater or performing arts. So that is there in the works, in these works. Now, yes, I would like to say something about his landscapes. I feel kind of see a distinct echo of Turner in his, specifically in his Shahjatpur landscapes. Uh, and we have no way uh, of knowing whether he had seen Turner closely. But I have strong uh, inkling that he might have also been influenced by the wash impression that we encounter in Turner's work, in the evocation of atmosphere and treatment of light.
It is very likely because they had a very vast library which was very well stocked for its time. They had almost 7,000 books in their library, not to speak of other collections and artifacts. And they had regular visitors from Britain, whether it is the the viceroy or whether it is the other minions, the colonial government, and of course Havel himself was inspiring other people to come and visit them. Rodenstein comes and visits them. So there was a constant flow of people coming and visiting them, and Tagore himself was traveling, crisscrossing the world. He was one of the greatest travelers that you can think of in his time. He was a world traveler, a globetrotter, and he was constantly writing, egging his nephews to come out of their south veranda, look at the world, particularly Japanese art. But he himself was also instrumental in bringing the best of whatever he thought wherever he went, whether he went to Bauhaus, whether he went to England, whether he went to the United States, or whether he went to China or the Southeast Asia. He was always sending things back and bringing books back. And obviously, so beyond their own library, they also had access to their Rubikas collection and interests, and they were being egged on. So the exposure level was extremely high. And mind you, these are people who come from very aristocratic family. So they were not in that sense professional artists that they dependent on the selling of their works. They were doing it for the pleasure involved in it and as an intellectual pursuit. And this is perhaps what marks them out. And so, anyway, coming back to the masks, these were like portraits, and but portraits with a difference because they were all painted disjointed from the body as only a sort of exaggerated mark. So there is an element of exaggeration, there is an element of theater in it, and as we know, the Tagore household was equally interested in theatrical productions. And Abanindranath's own interest in popular theatre and popular folk forms would manifest itself very soon in the form of him not only writing for children but writing Jatra Palas, which took up a major period in the 1930s, and we are going there now. That is strictly speaking outside the purview of today's discussion because we are restricting ourselves to visual arts. But nevertheless, it must be remembered that when 1930 Gaganendranath takes ill and he had paralysis, partial paralysis, for the next 8 years he suffers and he becomes speechless. And Abanindranath loses his partner in the studio and he is so depressed that he completely stops painting for the next 8 years. From 1930 to 1938, he doesn't paint. He comes back to painting very briefly in 38, but the major section of his painting is done between 1900 and 1930. So those 30 years basically. And the last body of work that he did before he stops painting was a set called the Arabian Nights, which are based loosely on the stories of the Arabian Nights, the fables, and they're fantastic stories, and which gave him an opportunity to explore many registers. One classic example is this story of the hunchback and the fishbone, where you see that Baghdad is basically early 20th century Kolkata. There are, and him is the superlative narrator and storyteller. But the main thing is happening in the center of the painting, and the space is divided in a sort of a miniature kind of space, step by step. So the lowest band, they're in bands, there are three major bands. So the lowest band refers to which Professor Shiv Kumar, the art historian who's written this huge monograph on Abanindranath, has quite clearly stated that it is something to do with his experience of Chitpur Road, which was a very cosmopolitan part of the town, which is very close to Jorasanko. You just step out of the alley and you are in Chitpur Road, just teeming with foreigners, teeming with business, and all kinds of activity. So, in a nutshell, that was the heart of 19th century commerce in Kolkata. So, you can imagine how powerful that impact was. You would see Armenians, you would see Chinese, you would see Afghans, you would see British, you would see Indians from all parts of the country mingling there. And some of it is you can see in the lowest band, and then you have the main section of where the hunchback, who is invited by this tailor couple, comes to have food with them, chokes on a fishbone, and the story starts unraveling from there because they want to pass on the death of the man on somebody else, their neighbors, and so on and so forth. Like any fables, it ultimately lands up in this comedy of errors where they are almost on the verge of being executed, when it was realized that the man actually hadn't died and they were all saved. But that story is just one part of it. What is overlaying it is Abanindranath's direct visual references to experiential reality that he was observing. There is a reference to Tagore and Company, which was a company, Indo-British company started by his own grandfather, Dwarkanath Tagore. Then there is a reference to the artist himself on the topmost band, where you see an artist entertaining two British guests who also happen to have little hunchbacks. So these are all asides, these are all additions and layers of narration. And in a way, it is indicative of how he was interested, how he got interested in theatre. It is, in a way, an visual representation of the theatre of life that was playing around him, where only one strand is the original story of Arabian Nights, and there were many, many, many other strands. And the character on the top band is recognized as that of the artist himself by, again, none other than Professor Shiv Kumar, because there is a painting that is hanging behind the pankha, half hidden by the pankha, which is apparently the painting of a large oil painting of Dwarkanath, which used to hang in their living room, which makes the identification. So even he himself is inserted into this narrative, so he takes on that role. And then, of course, it's colonial India, so you have the British Union Jack flying on the terrace on the night sky, and the clock on the mantelpiece would tell you it's 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning. So it's very late at night when all this drama is unfolding and so on. So these are all asides. Um, then, as I said, for 8 years he stops working and he comes back, and the last body of work that we have come across is the Krishna Mangal series, where he goes back to the folk traditions.
Yes, about the folk. You see, that particular time saw a very interesting resurgence of the folk. We will remember how Jamini Roy was experimenting with his folk idiom, and at that particular time, in 1937, there was a show by Jamini Roy in Society of Oriental Art, where Gagananath came, and even in his paralyzed state, and he was so impressed that he had tears in his eyes. And After this show is over, Guru Shodai Datta, who was a avid collector of folk art and artifacts, he had a show of his collection. Uh, so this collection was finally housed in Guru Shodai Museum later. So these are the facts, and at the same time, we should remember that Gagananath Tagore, he himself was a collector of folk art and artifacts, and at the same time, we should remember that how Nandalal Bose was actually experimenting with folk, not only folk style of art, but also with folk elements and folk narratives, and the everyday lives in his works, in Horipura Congress posters. So, in totality, in as a total, if we see it in totality, we can see that there is this, temper of the time. The folk was in the temper of the time. Now, the other thing that I am interested in about this work, this particular work of Krishna Lila, is that there is a script in the here in Bengali which says that Krishna's Mastuto Bhai. So it is like Krishna's maternal cousin. Now, there is a proverb in Bengali which goes like chore chore mastuto bhai. So it is so here, which
Cousin.
meaning, the meaning
Yeah.
of that is thieves are maternal cousins, which obviously alludes to Balaram here, who was an accomplice of Krishna in the barter stealing mission.
Cousin brothers, yes.
So here I can
Yes,
recall
yes, indeed.
a painting which I have seen far early, I mean, much earlier in the Museum of Academy of Fine Arts, Kolkata.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
That,
painting of a hen where he has written omelette pokhi. I mean, in Bengali, he has written it. So, which means omelette bird. So, this is a very interesting transference. Uh, has a core of humor that completely transforms the line of narrative at times. So that is another way of looking at his works, specifically the works with the scripts with humor in it.
yes, yes, that is very much there. As was evident in the Bengal Actor series from then on, that he had a very strong humorous streak that comes across even in the way he writes, and of course in the works. And it is a very playful manner of looking at things, and the play is becoming increasingly more important in his work. And that is also the excuse that he gives for stopping to paint, because he says, I'm playing with words, I'm becoming a wordsmith. Or the found objects that he was collecting in Kutumkatam towards the end of his life, or the book where he was writing the jatras and inserting images from contemporary advertisement, almanacs, printed things, magazines, all manner of things. So, you have a reference in Khuddud Jatra to Bharata worshipping Rama's slippers, and the image is an advertisement of Radu's shoes, which was a shop in College Street Market. So, these kinds of registering on overlaps does not really fit with our image of Abanindranath being the serious nationalist artist at all. And unfortunately, these works were rarely seen. So, in the public imagination, Abanindranath by and large was frozen in this early body of his works that were produced around 1900 to 1905 or 1910 maximum. And what happens to him is that he actually moves away and explores many more territories. So, and we don't do justice to an artist as diverse and as inventive as him by freezing him in one little box, which was only but one part of his total orb. That is the main contention of presenting his case. Now, if we come to Gaganendranath, his elder brother, again we see this very notion of what um, one would call eclecticism, that they are being very intellectually aware in the tradition of the Japanese Wengen painting. They were thinker people, thinker artists. It's not just about making an image, it's also, they had not only wide exposure, but they were also very intellectually engaged with the world around them, whether it's in the form of tradition, whether it is in the form of linguistic tropes, and whether it is uh, how they respond to the reality of the day, you know. And in Gaganendranath, we see obviously a very direct influence. There are again three, four strands in Gaganendranath's work. One, you can loosely say, where he is looking at the Far Eastern Russianing techniques. And for that, obviously, the Japanese artist and Okakura Kakuzo and this whole idea of Pan Asianism was obviously responsible. I dwelt on that. What he does with it, when he internalizes it, is the first body of work would be the illustrations that he did for his own uncle, Rabindranath Tagore, when he wrote his biography of the first part of his life, Jibon Shriti. You know, and then he tries that out, exploring the landscapes, and then cityscapes. The city roofs seen from afar, done in brush and ink in a sort of a very minimalistic style. So he was constantly experimenting with what he has learned. So he's not happy with only bamboo stalks and cranes and and those stock in trade images of Far Eastern art. Once he masters that, he immediately tries out things on his own. Yes, Shamindro, this is the cityscape, and you wanted to come in here. Yes.
I think he is the first person who has made cityscape in uh, the whole scenario. I mean, like this, I cannot recall anybody who has made cityscape as such at that time. Though cityscape is a very big thing. I mean, we are not living in, all of us are not living in the rural place, but somehow, when painting, when taking a subject of painting, we are not using, I mean, they are not using cityscape as a subject. So that is, I think, that should be considered as an important point. I'm not sure though that he's the first person. We have to check it out.
Right. Then, yes, possibly you are right. Because I don't remember seeing another cityscape in a contemporary work of art. So, yeah, even in terms of exploring new genres, you could credit him by taking very bold steps. Um, but what Gaganendranath, one of the strands that he's best known for is his caricatures. And the caricatures again had three different registers. One was looking at contemporary society and its hypocrisy. The other was religious orthodoxy and the hypocrisy inherent in that. And the third one was looking at politics of the day. And all these three things were addressed by these three uh, folios that he produced. The first one was in 1915 called Adbhut Lok, the second one in 1917 called Virubhajra, and the third one in 1921 called Reform Screens. Reform Screens is primarily a funny look, or sort of scathing satirical look at all the reforms that are going on, and he doesn't spare anybody, even the Brahmos for that matter. But the target was primarily hypocrisy that he saw around him. Like the first one, we are going to show is a work from Virubhajra, or the realm of the absurd, and it is a gentleman is reading a news item in the newspaper that some two Europeans were caught fishing in the holy city of Hardwar, and he's obviously a Brahmin, as you can mark out from the shikha, which is standing on its end, and he's very upset. The wife's hairpins are bursting out of the hair, and what is she doing? She's basically cutting a fish, which was one of the favorite staple diets of Bengalis, average Bengalis. So, this whole hypocrisy of getting scandalized by something which you are indulging in every day just because it happens in a so called holy city is the occasion for Gaganendranath's mirth. And then we have other images of where the Maharaja of Bardhaman, who's a big man, who's saying that my love for the country is as big as I am, or something to that effect. And we all knew that he got the title of Maharaja by being very close to the British administration, and he was hated in the Swadeshi circle. And you also wanted to say something here, Shomindra.
There is this thing when Gaganendranath approached the Maharaja of Bardwan for donation for Shahitya Parishad. He was not very much enthusiastic about it. But it was said that he was absolutely generous about giving assistance to the uh, European clubs even before they have asked for it. So you see how the question of empowered and privileged race becomes uppermost here. One other thing about this work, uh, you can see the chair Gaukulandranath is sitting on. It's a low one, and we know that at a certain time, all the furniture of the Chego residence were changed, and the new ones, which are in Oriental fashion, were made. So in this work, which has a satirical tone, it is as if the tone itself is strengthened by the subtext of the Indian style coach where the Gaukulandranath is sitting, and he is sitting with a kind of a smile in his face, as if he's observing the whole thing and enjoying the whole thing. Is not looking like a person who has come for something, who has come for some help, for some sort. But it is both are smoking, and he was smoking a cigar where we can see that Gaukulandranath is smoking with from gargara, which is a kind of Indian Bengal thing. Uh, so all of them become kind of prop in the scheme of signification. If we look at his shoes, his Indian attire, and to compare it with the Maharaja's dresses and all, we can uh, create a definite sense of differentiation, which actually Gaukulandranath was intended to put here.
Right. And what I find very interesting in this one with the social satire about the male gaze, which is very subtle, is these two ladies wrapped up in shawls walking through a railway platform where all eyes are focused on them, including the lights hanging above, seem to have developed eyes and gazing. And this, in my view, is one of the earliest examples where an artist is basically showing what a male gaze can be and how intrusive it can be. The one on the right is more specific to the social custom of dowry and dowry related deaths. So he's seen the death himself is marrying off this very young girl to a tin of kerosene, obviously used in bride burning, and there is another thuggish looking gentleman who's holding the daughter's father and the daughter herself with these ropes around their necks, almost taking them like sacrificial goats, the sacrificial animals. So this was very scathing, and so this is one strand of Gaganendranath. The other strand was, of course, his cityscapes developed into nightscapes, where he's playing with light, which highlights his interest in light and its drama. There are quite a few examples of this strand. We have the Maiden Theatre, then we have Durga Puja procession, where you use dramatic light. He uses a kind of wash technique here. But again, there is a fourth strand, which is what makes him stand out amongst his contemporaries, particularly, was the so called Cubist phase. And he did that on and off, where he actually employs a linguistic trope of Cubism. I would venture to say of late Cubism, more akin to Robert and Sonia Delaunay or Metzinger, or on a sort of post-Cubist of the 1910s, but he takes on that some of the formal tropes and internalizes it and turns it into something quite different. They are often romantic landscapes, they are often dramatic architectural spaces where he uses these breaking facets as a device to bring in a very large space in a constricted space of a small painting. And the highlight has always been this play with light and shade. So, more than just a formal thing of just looking at something and then dismantling it, his project was quite different from classical um, cubist project that you see in Picasso and Braque. And there are quite a few examples of that, and they obviously have a preference for tonal rendering because, like I said, there is an interest in light, and that light, the dramatic light thing, is carried over not only from the cityscapes or the nightscapes into the cubist phase also.
What I find is about the Gauguinar's this session of work, this series of work is the light, the tonal light is very important here. I mean, rather than the color, it is rather light, flat tonal lights, and the kaleidoscopic effect of light. They are as if moving. They are as if with sharp edge, and the sharp edge of Gauguinar's work in all over. I mean, there are two types of work of Bhagavath Tagore, but mostly there are very emphatic, straight, angular lines. He has, I mean, created in his works, in his composition. So I felt that the city, in its intrinsic, uh, you know, value, it has been, translated into straight lines and angular lines. So for him, not only painting the city from the above, that cannot even painting the interior, painting the stages, and together with painting different kind of Orphic or futuristic, composition, where the straight line and curved line are coming together and making a kind of interplay in between. So it is a very much modernistic uh, approach towards taking the visual into another level, and it is not coming from a copying something from someone, but actually assimilating the modern points of modern movements, for example, from futurism or orphism or cubism a bit, and using it to make his own composition out of his own experience, visual experience.
Yes, yes, he's obviously very good at internalizing it, and that is what all good artists should be doing. But within that so-called proto-cubist phase, if you like, for want of a better word, there is an amazing range. There are things which are obviously highlighting the light and the faceting, which he uses the cubist breakage of space. There are others where he does use color, but those spaces are sort of like dramatic spaces, whether it's Al Kapuri or whether it is the magician with a lot of very bright red, almost a carpeted floor, which draws attention to. The figures there look like they're from Chinese opera, or the abstract work, which is um, almost pure color, although very muted tones, but they are so in a way he was exploring the whole range possible within that language, and you can see that he's pushing it this way and that way, so it is.
Into
Yes.
the what I was suggesting is basically there are color. You have to use color in order to create light or whatever,
Yeah, yeah.
because it's a painting. But my intention was to say that that he was actually creating light more than color, using color. I mean, like if I take Rothko, we can say that this is color. This is, yeah, there are light, because you
Yeah.
understand what I actually
Yes, yes, yes.
mean to say.
True, true,
Because the
true.
light is coming out of it. The light is important here rather than the color.
Yes,
So that
yes.
is where I actually
Yes, yes. No, no.
focusing
That
on.
is because of they are, like I said, they are primarily tonal. So yes,
Yeah.
even when color is used, they also have tonal values. Right. We move on to a set of portraits that he did, like everybody else in the Tagore household. He was also quite a master of recording things, and we come across a portrait of Shunayani Devi, and she is the third person from Jorashako that is in the purview of our discussion today. And interestingly, she was not mentioned in any public discourse of her time, although there are admirers of her work. One of the early admirers was Stella Kramrisch. There are also references in people writing, but by and large, she kind of remained invisible. And one of the classic example was that drawing of Nandalal, where he shows the the south veranda and how people were relaxing. You have Nandalal himself sharing a work with Kumar Swami, and then you have Gaganendranath Tagore reading a book. You have Abanindranath taking a snooze, and Shamarendranath sitting in an easy chair, and so on and so forth. But that was again a very male world. Shunayani Devi's world was very much to do with the Antapur. She was married off quite early, and she was very fortunate to have been married into an illustrious family. She was married to Rajani Mohan Roy, who happened to be the grandson of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And it was Rajani Mohan's uh, interest in egging her on to continue to paint that launched her into this painting. And interestingly, she was a self-taught artist, despite being born in the Tagore household where everybody was exposed to some form of training, although almost all of the Tagores were self-taught in that sense. Technically speaking, they never went to an art school. In Shunani Devi's case, even that tutored tutoring happened mostly by observation, looking at her brothers and what they were doing. She was never really had the fortune of having a tutor employed to teach her how to paint. So she was a truly self-taught artist of a time, and we are only rediscovering her works in the recent times with the resurgence of interest in feminist history. We discovered that here at the end of at the beginning of the last century, we had a painter of notable who's a notable painter and whose working life spanned nearly 15 years, and she was so much uh, dependent on her husband's encouragement, actually, that when he passed away, she stops painting completely. But there is a significant body of work produced in those 15 years, and we know from anecdotal records that she was very regular at her practice, and she would sit at a regular time at 8:30 in the morning, work till midday, then take a break, and again in the afternoon we'll go back to work, and so on and so forth. Her works primarily concerned with the Antapur interior scenes, so women only, women centered things, and she was very fond of an aunt called Kumudini who had long tresses, so she painted those. She painted women in groups, women in discussion, in gossiping, women alone, them by themselves, in a pensive mood, thinking of things, or women with pets, and so on and so forth. And she was actually developed a language of her own. So it is very easy to spot Ashunayani Devi when we see it now.
But at the same time, it is a very important point to be noted that Jamini Roy, before be, start with his folk venture, uh, he went to uh, Tagore's family because Abhinavnath Tagore uh, told him to copy a portrait of Devendranath Tagore, which is there in the family. So Jamini Roy used to go there, and he must have seen her works. So it might happen that before he has started with his folk journey, Shunoni Devi could be one of the inspirations.
Yeah, that is a very important information. I think that needs to be looked into. So it's quite possible that it was Shunani's work which triggered his initial interest, apart from, of course, his exposure to his to folk art in many other forms elsewhere. But yes, you never know when these things work as a trigger. Shunani herself was shown, her works were reproduced in Probashi and Bharatbarsha, and she also showed in one international exhibition, two international exhibitions, the Bauhaus show in 1922 that came to Calcutta and was shown along with Indian artists, that was organized by Tagore. Shunayani was part of it, and the Women's International Exhibition in 1927, which was held in England, and that was Shunayani also participated in it. But somehow our art historians have turned a blind eye to her legacy completely, and she was written out of the textbooks. But thankfully, there is a new interest. So hopefully, we will get to know more about her in the coming years. The next artist would be the classic example of what the first generation of students of Abanindranath were, sort of spreading all over India when Abanindranath himself is gently moves away from that tradition. And I think one of the iconic cases would be Chitin Majumdar, uh, who was hailed as a sort of saint painter because of his interest in spiritual and sort of uh, bhakti ras, so to speak, of all things. Chaitanya Dev, his life and passion was one of the major themes, and he continued throughout his life to paint in the wash technique, as instituted initially by Abanindranath. His paintings does have some emotional charge, but it also has many of the manneristic traits for which Bengal school quickly sort of was criticized, and there was a reaction against Bengal school. So, in some ways, the weaknesses and the strengths of Bengal school are both embodied in Kitin Majumdar's work. And he had a rather long life, and he's one of the sort of national treasure artists now. Um, and this is an image of Lakshmi that Shomindro you wanted to comment upon.
Yeah, I find this Lakshmi very interesting because of the fact that she is nude. I mean, it reminds me of the work of Hussein, where he made nude Saraswati that has been criticized vehemently all over India. And I don't know. I mean, at that time, how could Kitindranath painted this thing? Yeah, there is a traditional thing that he has referred in this work, but the general tendency of our visual practice that grown up after the on the basis of Ravi Verma's work, we generally refer to the god and goddesses of from his works and all, through the calendars and all. I mean, so far as uh, the paintings are concerned, so we don't really see any nude Lakshmi there. So here I find it very interesting from that point.
If we now look at the other end of the spectrum, that is, what was happening to the rebellious students who went out and formed the Jubilee Art Academy, and many of some quite a few of them actually were came back and finished their education in the government school of art, and that happens mostly after Abanindranath leaves. So there is a swing in the pedagogic mode of the college. So from being the source of starting this Neo Bengal school, or whatever you like to call it, Oriental practices or Bengal school, uh, there was also a very strong underlining movement which went counter to it. And that counter continued both inside the college which got a fillip after Abanindranath leaves, and also outside the college in the form of the academy. There are many noted practitioners in this. There would be the earlier ones will be Annada Prasad Bagchi, Shamacharan Srimani, Bamapada Bandyopadhyay, Shashi Kumar Hesh, Jamini Prakash Ganguly, who interestingly became the assistant principal after Abanindranath leaves. And then you have Bhavani Charan Laha or BC Law, as he used to sign his names. Fanindranath Bose, who went away and died in Scotland. Devi Prasad Rai Chaudhary was one of the younger people who also kind of can be seen straddling both the worlds. He was very skilled in one thing and he also was very adoptive of these things. But for again the sake of brevity, we are going to focus on two very iconic representatives of this school of thought, if you like. And the first one being Hemen Majumdar, who actually never studied, came back to the government school of art. His study was almost entirely in the Jubilee School of Art. And as we know, he happens to be the forefather of Shomindros. So I think Shomindro will have to take on the mantle of discussing his works.
Well, yes, Hemen Majumdar was indeed a very important painter of this particular period. In fact, you could say he was some kind of a rebel at this juncture. He was opposing the Bengal school's insistence on Indianness, both in form and technique, not only through his art practice, but also through a consistent discourse that he developed in the numerous art writings. Uh, and he published, which he has published in his lifetime. To get back to this very beginning, at a very young age, he actually ran away from his home in Mymensingh, and he came to Calcutta and enrolled himself in the government school of art. This was also an extremely short-lived stint. He joined the art school in 1911 and he left in 1912. Just the next year. He had an argument with the authorities regarding the construction of a gate to welcome the fifth George, who was coming at the time and who had to visit government school of art also. So the college was using the students for this project, and but it was paying them a pittance. So Majumdar didn't like the whole thing, and he left the college and joined Ranodha Gupta's Jubilee Academy to continue his lesson with in academic realism. And it is this style that he continued in his own whole life, you know. So for him, it was a complete journey of a academic naturalistic journey, which he has continued throughout his career. His entire body of works is on this style. And I was talking about the discourse, the writing that came out of his pen alongside his painting. That was an intellectual exercise for him. Accepting the part of practice of painting. So these writings were mainly directed against the Neo-Bengal school. The objection were mainly twofold. The first was, of course, against their lack of concern about contemporary life, the temporal and also the located reality. The second was about their almost phobic attitude about anything to do with West, especially oil paint. But this is interesting to note that Abanindranath Tagore, who was the father of the style, had been influenced by Irish illuminated illustrations to begin with when he was beginning his uh, career, and later we can identify Turner or Art Nouveau, etc., in his works. And we have Govardhana Tagore, where we can identify the modernist uh, influences from the West. This objection was recorded in many of his uh, texts. Some were published at his lifetime, and later there was this book called Chobi Chashma. We can see there that Hemendranath's these writings has been published there. It is after his death, much after his death. We know that he had formed the Indian Academy of Art in 1990, together with Atul Bose and Jamini Roy and BC Law. And there, uh, they have a kind of publication there, and this was a journal. And in 1920, the first journal came out, and the name of the journal was Journal of Academy of Art. Academy of Art. But in that journal, if we see that he has published it's different kinds of texts and different kind of works, like even he has published the work of Chuktai, who is a very important artist from Bengal school. And we can see that Jamini Roy, when he was struggling with his own area of work, and he was working with this wash painting and all these things, that has also been published. Those works have also been published in this magazine. He also came up with a 5-issue publication, which seems now to be somewhat self-promotional, called The Art of Mr. H. Majumdar, and in Bengali it is called Shilpi Hemendranath. And at that very juncture of time, his paintings were regularly published in the prominent periodicals of Bengal, like Mashik Bushumati and Bharatbarsho, so on and so forth. And thus, he has infiltrated even in the middle class homes through these images. So he has achieved his goal in this way. I mean, he finally became popular at a very young age. Now, it is very unfortunate that we remember him only as a painter of wet-clothed, sensual women, and do not concern ourselves with his varied oeuvre, like his landscapes or portraits or some other figurative works. He had become widely popular during his own lifetime and got a number of royal patronage as well. He was a kind of court painter in Patiala, and he was also patroned by by the Maharaja of Mayurbhanj. Now, his main concern, what I felt that his main concern was to capture the locality, the located culture of his people, the time where he is living in, and what he felt that if he uses oil paint and if he uh, follow the style of British academic realism, it would be pointless to object to it just because um, it is the style is Western and the medium is Western. Because he was painting the life, the material, the time of his own. So he is no way related to the West. He is completely rooted to his time.
Yeah. No, I think you made a fair point. I think it is true, but that is the unfortunate thing because um, Abanindranath and Gaganendranath being, their influence was in a particular strata of society. If I look at Hemen Majumdar and his appeal, it was much more popular, and perhaps part of it is to do with the fact that he has to make a living out of his art, which none of these Tagores have to do. They had other means to make a living, and Hemen Majumdar didn't have that luxury. So he had to sort of fend for himself in a market situation. So that's point number one. Number two is that Puritanism that you're talking about was much more evident in the proponents of the Bengal school than the master who's known to be fathering it, and that unfortunately does not translate very well. So you take a position, imagining that Abanindranath is, believes in such and such things, where actually his practice moves away from the stated beliefs at the beginning of his career, and that is precisely the point of talking in depth about Abanindranath or Gaganendranath's output or over, so to speak, that they actually have been extremely eclectic and experimental in their attitude. So the puritanical attitude, which Hemen Majumdar is referring to as something which is not really looking at contemporary reality, perhaps applies much more to the proponents of quote unquote Bengal school, to the generations of people who trained under Abanindranath, but not so much to Abanindranath himself. And that is an interesting point. The third interesting thing that I found, that his combativeness as a young man to actually take the fight on an intellectual plane, that he starts a magazine, he starts publicizing his own works, but not only that, he gathers people around him to write in this journal and propose an alternative to this overwhelmingly established view that would be in the mid 1915 20s, that it has got so much importance. Of course, he was selling, he was publishing his works, he was very particular about those things that he's seen, and he reached middle class homes in the form of reproductions through these albums that he made, or the reproductions that happened in Doinik Bashumati or other journals which he found to promote his work. But in this, in the if you look at some of the articles that he wrote, for instance. There is a desire to engage intellectually. It is not just about saying, okay, this is the market and this is what demands and I'm supplying the market. There is much more to it. He's taking a stand, rightly, wrongly, which can be criticized as voyeuristic. It has been criticized even in his own time as almost bordering on the Ashleel sometimes, but he takes up that cudgel and wants to defend his position. Whether they are defensible or not is besides the point. But the fact that in a young man you see that intellectual integrity to believe what he is doing and to stand by it, and also to propagate it in in the forms that are in writing, not only in the work. So his combativeness comes through, and I think that is what sets him apart from many other contemporaries who were perhaps as successful, or perhaps in sometimes some cases more successful than him, that they never went into this. There's a grumbling, there's a grudging acknowledgement that okay, the intellectual space is taken up by Bengal school and we are doing what we are doing outside that. And here in him you see that he's taking the fight and actually coming out with something which is substantial, which has been which needs to be looked at. And I think that is one of the major contributions of him. Now, coming back to his works, obviously he was a master of techniques. He was a excellent watercolorist. He was an excellent oil painter. It's rather sad that you see so many fakes of his in the market, because if you look closely at the surface of his works and you see that whether it is impasto, whether it's glazing, whether it's scrubbing, whether it's cumbling, all those things he actually have learnt very well. We often say that so and so learned the academic technique very well, but when it comes to actually seeing examples, they sometimes fail the test, but he doesn't. And there was also the method that he employs, and in his works, where you wanted to say something about the combination of images and how he actually paints those more popular things about women in white sari.
Yes, that is something very interesting about the wet clothed women that he has painted. There is definitely a strong sensuality about them, and a space of uh, solitude as well. This changes the viewer into a voyeur, as if they are looking at something forbidden and out of reach. So, as if they're uh, intruding into a private space of someone else's. But yet, I feel that there is a certain sense of power and agency in these women, about these women. They are absorbed within a space of thought, and this space is their very own. In a way, they were not merely objects of desire, but are desiring subjects themselves. Uh, Even when Hemen Majumdar portrays women within a space of domesticity, there are not the usual domestic uh, space. I mean, that space are differing from one to another work. So, for example, uh, if we see the painting of Grihalakshmi, which means the goddesses of home, we see that she is a housewife slicing vegetables uh, with and she is not very happy with this. See her body language and her frown. So you see, there is a clear incongruence between the title and the visual narrative. The way the narrative is unfolding itself. The imagined goddess of home is actually irritated and by the space of the home, and the intention is very subversive. Or if we take another painting, um, which uh, which is titled as Bhagyalakshmi. This title suggests our interpretation in a way. Here we will see that a woman is there who is spinning on a charka, a common household activity then, but it is implied that she holds the bhagyo or destiny of not only herself but of the nation in her action. We know, of course, about the significance of the charka as a symbol in the nationalist struggle. So she is not confined only within the periphery of or the space of a domesticity, but goes beyond it. This painting has been used in a portrait of Chittaranjan Das, uh, where we'll see it's in watercolor, where we'll see that Chittaranjan Das is sitting somewhere on the chair, and on the wall, um, a painting is hanging, and the painting is of this Lakshmi. So now we can identify uh, and we can see the intention of the artist clearly here, because we know Chittaranjan Das as a uh, freedom fighter, and this charkha is related to nationalism. And when Hemen Majumdar is putting his painting within his another work of art and relating it to the person who is a freedom fighter, who is a person who is struggling against the British rulers, and putting that Bhagyalakshmi uh, in the space, that becomes a very interesting uh, narration. That creates a very interesting narration altogether. So it's an interesting combination of nationalism and empowered femininity.
Yeah, that is very much the position that I would imagine Raja Ravi Varma would take, because that was the whole project. And in a way, one can see a continuation of that project that was started by Ravi Varma. So that is a very important strand that continued till the 1940s, I would say, and then it was taken over by other oppositional forces which worked against the mainstreaming of Bengal school, so to speak. But yes, it's an interesting trajectory, and like I said, it kind of shows that he is willing to engage intellectually in this debate in his own capacity as an artist of repute and popularity. Move to our last artist, that is Atul Bose. And Atul Bose was part of this trio who established that academy that Shomindra was referring to. The third one will surprise us no end, and I'll come to that very end. So it was these two and two more, which is Bhavani Charan Laha, BC Law, And these were the people who were instrumental in establishing that academy of Indian fine arts, uh, which was sort of set up as a counter or a parallel to the mainstream things which were propagating the Bengal school. So Atul Bose was actually trained in Jubilee School, and then he came back and finished his studies from the school of Government Art School. Jamini Prakash was, I think, was his teacher, and then he goes abroad to the Royal Academy in London and comes back with a degree of a Royal Academician. And he was actually primarily a portrait painter who was called upon, his services were called upon to paint portrait of every important personalities of his time, including the poet Rabindranath, Subhash Chandra Bose. But interestingly, the beginning of his life, when he was studying in the art school, he made a portrait of Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University, and who was a very well known person in his time. And that portrait won him a scholarship, which made it possible for him to go and study in the Royal Academy. So much so that portrait became so important that it was used in England when the obituary of Sir Ashutosh was written. I think it was in the Times of London, which he used that portrait. So, which was quite an honor in those times. And we have two works of these two gentlemen, Hemin Majumdar and Atul Bose, painting one of the famous socialite beauty of their time, Ranu Mukherjee. You can see a sort of difference in approach despite their similarities and the similar intellectual space from where they were coming. I would also like to draw the attention to the fact that sometimes these finished portraits, um, the drawings, the preparatory drawings for these finished portraits looked even more livelier than the finished portraits. So there are a couple of samples of those drawings, and that started rather early in his career. And it is often said that we know that the Bengal famine of 1943, which nearly saw the death of 3 million people, caused almost entirely a human made famine because of the stockpiling of food was basically taken away from the mouth of the people, which caused 3 million deaths, was such a ruinous, such a devastating, cataclysmic event that even everybody of their generation had to respond one way or the other. We know about how people like Jainul Abidin, Somnath Or, or Chitta Prasad went out, made drawings, and brought back the horrors that was happening outside the cities into the city and to the national consciousness, and how they were repressed by the British. But these so called sort of British trained artists also responded to the horrors of the famine. So there are works. There is a work of a mother and child by Atul Bose, or by Hemin Majumdar, and there is another work by Atul Bose. There are many works which are lost. Unfortunately, we haven't really have a good archive or a record of these people, so it's very difficult to trace their works. We all talk in hyperboles about them, and we don't really have too many reproductions, particularly of Bose. They are all scattered. They were in many private collections. They are also in some public institutions, especially portraitures. So I wish there would be somebody would take it upon themselves to go and document them properly. So to get a legacy of an artist, you need to have uh, good reproductions in front of you. In the absence of that, we can um, definitely say that Atul Bose in the genre of portraiture was definitely one of those definitive artists of his time. And that brings us to the end of the discussion today. I will just conclude by saying that the third artist that I was mentioning, or rather the fourth one, who was part of the academy, was Jamini Roy, who again found another trajectory very soon and part ways with this naturally a realist school of painting. And we know that will demand another session altogether, but just to mention that his beginnings were to be found in the in the Indian Academy of Art, along with Atul Bose, Hemen Majumdar, and B.C. Law.